The room smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, which was fitting because what happened in that room was the oldest story in the world, and it had been burning for 11 years. I remember the way Dr. Harlan Peck leaned back in his chair, that specific leather chair he'd had reupholstered twice because he said good chairs were an investment, and he smiled at me. He smiled at me the way you smile at someone you've already beaten, the way you smile at someone when the game is already over and they just haven't been told yet. He had a pen in his hand. He was clicking it. Click, click, click. And then my attorney slid a manila folder across the table and said 4 words, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore. And Dr. Harlan Peck, who had built his entire reputation on my research, who had taken my name off papers I had written, who had smiled at me in faculty meetings for a decade while quietly making sure I would never be promoted past associate, Dr. Harlan Peck stopped clicking his pen. He stopped breathing, I think. The color left his face the way water leaves a drain. Slow, then all at once. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how we got here. You need to understand who I was before this and who I became during it, and why those are 2 completely different things that it took me a very long time to recognize as separate. My name is Dr. Nadia Osei. I am 41 years old. I am a cognitive neuroscientist, which means I spend a significant portion of my professional life studying how the human brain stores, distorts, and occasionally obliterates memory, which is, in retrospect, a particularly rich specialty when your entire career is built on someone else systematically trying to erase yours. I grew up in Accra. I came to the United States for my undergraduate degree on a scholarship I had applied for 17 times before it came through. 17, because I kept a list, and I counted. And when people talk about grit, as though it is a personality trait rather than a survival mechanism, I think about that list, and about the 8 years of my life it represents. I defended my PhD dissertation at 31 in a room that held exactly 9 people. One of whom fell asleep during my methodology section, and I did not take it personally because the methodology section was genuinely dense, and also he was 83 and had been in the field since before I was born. I did not inherit money. I did not marry money. I did not stumble into money or luck my way into a position or get handed anything by anyone who was not also expecting something in return. Every single credential after my name I earned in the way that leaves marks, late nights and early mornings, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from hard work itself, but from proving yourself to people who made their decision about you before you walked through the door. I know that kind of exhaustion. I know what it looks like in the mirror at 6 in the morning. I know how it changes the way you carry yourself into rooms. My grandmother, who raised me after my mother passed when I was 8, had a saying she deployed sparingly, which meant that when she said it, you listened. She would look at you with those eyes that had seen everything this world could produce and survived most of it without any particular bitterness about the parts that should have been bitter, and she would say, quote 1, I thought I understood that the first time she said it to me. I was 23. I understood the words. I didn't understand the weight of them, the specific texture of what living that sentence feels like when you are in the middle of it. I understand it now. I understand it the way you understand things you have lived through rather than merely heard about. I am also, for the record, approximately 5 feet and 2 inches tall, which means that people underestimate me at a rate of roughly twice per day on average, and I have found this to be one of the most consistently useful features of my existence. I have the kind of face that reads as patient, even when I am not. I have been told I seem approachable. I have been told I seem non-threatening. I have been told by a departmental colleague once that I was easy to underestimate, and he meant it as a compliment, which was the funniest thing anyone said to me in that calendar year. I have learned to treat these observations the way a chess player treats an opponent who smiles too early, as information. I was 30 years old when I met Dr. Harlan Peck. I had just been accepted into the neuroethics research program at Whitmore University. not a famous school by the name, but deeply serious in the field, the kind of institution where the buildings are an architectural crime, and the journals are excellent, and the funding is competitive enough to carry real weight. Harlan Peck was a full professor, 62 at the time, with a CV that ran to 16 pages and a reputation that had the specific gravity of old institutional power, unearned by its current holder, inherited from people who had actually built it. He had been a prodigy once, and legitimately. His early work on episodic memory consolidation in the early 90s had been genuinely important, cited, built upon, the kind of contribution that changes how a question is asked for the next generation. But that was 30 years before I met him. In the intervening decades, he had published steadily, impressively, by any outside measure, by doing something I did not yet understand how to name. He had learned to find people. Specifically, he had learned to find people who were good at the thing he had stopped being good at, which was generating original ideas. He found me at a departmental welcome reception in a room that smelled like warm Pinot Grigio and professional ambition in approximately equal measure. He walked over with the particular deliberateness of a man who does not cross a room without purpose, set down his glass, and said that he had read my application materials and found my proposed research framework unusually sophisticated. He said it the way you say something when you want to give just enough to see what the person does with it, not precisely a compliment, more like an experiment. I, who had been standing alone for 20 minutes because I didn't know anyone and couldn't figure out how to insert myself into conversations about conference travel logistics and departmental politics I didn't yet understand, felt the warmth of recognition the way a cold person feels a heater come on in an empty room. Immediate. Total. Disproportionate to the stimulus, had I been thinking clearly. That should have been the first thing I noticed. Not the compliment itself, but the precision of it, the way he had identified in 4 words exactly what I most needed to hear in that moment in that room. I have spent 15 years studying how memory works. I know that we encode moments of emotional significance more deeply, more vividly, and more durably than ordinary moments. I know that emotional encoding is one of the most easily manipulated processes in human cognition, and that the manipulation doesn't require ill intent to be effective, just awareness, however intuitive, of what someone needs. He had created an emotionally significant moment with the specific words that would resonate most with a person in my position. Whether he did it consciously or by instinct, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that it worked perfectly, and that it was the first of many moments that, looking back, contained in compressed form the entire shape of what was coming. I filed that moment under mentor. I should have filed it somewhere more careful. The second thing I should have noticed happened 3 months later. We had begun working together in what was presented as a mentorship arrangement, with the easy informality of a structure that is never written down, because writing it down would require naming what it is, and naming it would require negotiating terms that the stronger party doesn't want negotiated. He would provide lab access, institutional credibility, grant connections, and the specific kind of professional sponsorship that comes from a man with a 16-page CV recommending you to other men with long CVs in rooms you haven't been invited into yet. I would provide, as he put it, fresh thinking. I submitted my first paper for our shared review, a piece on memory reconsolidation in trauma survivors that I had been developing since the final chapter of my dissertation, the section that had taken me 18 months and 3 complete rewrites, and which represented the most developed version of my thinking to date. He read it. He made comments. He said it was excellent but needed framing adjustments before it could go to the journal. I said fine, because he had 16 pages of CV, and I had a 1-page publication list, and I was on a work visa that meant I needed this particular position to continue existing in this particular country. He came back 2 weeks later with a draft that was structurally still mine, same arguments, same data, same methodology, same conclusions. But the framing had been adjusted in ways that were largely cosmetic, and his name was now first on the byline. I looked at that byline for a long moment. I said, carefully, measuring each word, I thought perhaps the authorship order should reflect the primary intellectual contribution. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something slightly embarrassing at a dinner party. Gently pained, patient, a little disappointed, as though he had expected better from me. "Nadia," he said, and he said my name the way senior academics sometimes say the names of junior ones, with a warmth that contains a hierarchy. In this field, when a senior researcher mentors a junior researcher and provides the framing and credentialing context that makes the work publishable in top-tier journals, that is understood in the community to be a primary contribution. This isn't a business transaction. This is science, and science is collaborative, and collaboration in academia has an established logic that becomes clearer over time. He paused. The exposure you'll get from this publication will be significant, more significant than you might appreciate yet. He added, "How careers are built for junior researchers," meaning mine, as though he were doing me a favor, as though the question of whose idea it had been was beside the point. I nodded. I said I understood. I left his office and walked down the corridor and took the stairs instead of the elevator, because I needed the 6 flights to rearrange my face into something that looked like it had not just understood something important and upsetting. There was a woman in my cohort, a fellow postdoc named Blessing Adeyemi, who did computational models of memory bias and who had, in my observation over 3 months, the best instincts of anyone I had encountered in academic settings, the kind of instincts that come from being simultaneously very smart and very honest about what you're actually seeing rather than what you want to see. She watched the arrangement between me and Harlan develop with an expression I can only describe as careful grief, not surprise, not outrage, just the specific sorrow of someone who recognizes a pattern and is calculating how to be useful to the person inside it. She took me to lunch sometime in the late spring, bad sandwiches from the campus cafe. We split a bag of chips because neither of us had sorted out the faculty meal plan properly, and she said, quote 12, I said I would try. I meant it. She said, quote 13. She looked at me. She wasn't performing concern. She was just being accurate, which was the thing I valued most about her. I'm not saying stop working with him. I'm saying see it clearly for what it is. I said that Harlan was from a different generation, that the norms had been different when he established his professional habits, that he was adjusting them, that the arrangement was temporary while I built enough independent credibility to change the dynamic. I said all of it with great conviction and very limited evidence. Blessing ate a chip. She said, "Okay." She said it the way you say okay when you love someone and you know they are not ready and you are going to be there when they are, and you are not going to say I told you so, because that is not what the moment is for. I think about that lunch now with a specific kind of gratitude that does not have a clean name in English. She was right in a way that cost her nothing to be right about, and she told me anyway, and she did not hold it against me that I didn't listen. That is a particular kind of generosity that I have tried to carry forward. The arrangement became, over the following 2 years, not an exception, but a structure. I would develop a research question, sometimes a seed, sometimes a full methodology with preliminary data and a literature review, and it would go into what we called our quote 16 which was a shared folder on the departmental server and a recurring bi-weekly meeting in his office where he would make notes on my proposals in red ink and talk about quote 17 in ways that were intellectually engaging and epistemically irrelevant to the question of who had done the thinking. Papers came out. His name was always first. Mine appeared second on 6 of them, third on 2, behind a graduate student who had provided statistical support for a single section. Once my name was fourth on a paper I had written approximately 80% of by any reasonable measure. I raised each of these as they occurred because I am not a person who allows things to accumulate silently without at least naming them. Each time he explained it, each explanation was slightly different in its specifics and identical in its structural conclusion. This is how it works. You will understand better over time. Your turn is coming. Be patient with the process. He expressed on the fourth paper disappointment at what he called my quote 18. He said he was surprised at me. He said science was not about credit. He said it was about the work. He was right about that, taken in isolation. He was deploying a truth in service of a lie, which is the specific manipulation I find most difficult to respect because it is the hardest to argue against without sounding like you don't understand the truth. I stopped raising it. I want to be precise about this. I stopped raising it not because I stopped believing I was right, but because I calculated the cost of raising it against the cost of not raising it. And in my specific circumstances, the visa, the grant dependencies, the letter-writing power he held over my professional reputation, the cost of not raising it was temporarily lower. The specific feeling of swallowing something that tastes like injustice because the alternative is a worse outcome, is something I think a lot of people will understand, and I don't want to rush past it. Making a calculated choice to be quiet is not the same as accepting the thing you're quiet about. Those are different processes. I kept them separate. What I did instead of raising it was work and document. I keep everything. This is a habit my grandmother installed in me when I was 11 years old, and she noticed in the small things I was already keeping, school papers, letters, cards, receipts from things I had bought with saved pocket money, a tendency she recognized from her own practice. She told me, people who have less power than other people need to keep better records than other people. She said it as a practical matter, plainly, not bitterly. She had a shoebox under her bed with 30 years of documents that had saved her twice from people who counted on her not having the paperwork to prove what she knew. I am her granddaughter. I kept records. The third thing I should have noticed happened at a major conference in Boston in my 4th year. Significant conference, the kind that shapes who gets discussed in the field for the following 2 years. And the opening reception was full of people performing more confidence than they had and drinking more wine than was advisable. There was a panel discussion about attribution in interdisciplinary research. Afterwards, in the milling around portion of the evening, a researcher from Columbia, whose work I had admired for several years, Dr. Vera Lynn, computational approaches to memory interference, genuinely important work, came over to me. She said, "I read the reconsolidation paper, the framework in the second section. That's yours, isn't it?" It was not phrased as a question. She said it quietly, not accusingly, with the careful neutrality of someone who has made a judgment and wants to see what the person in question does with it. I said I had contributed significantly to the framework, yes. She said, "I know Harlan's work from the 90s. I've read everything he published in that period and the decade after. What's in that paper is not that kind of thinking. It is yours." A pause. I want you to know that some people in this field can tell the difference. Not everyone, but some people, the ones who matter to the conversation. I said thank you. I held my wine glass. I smiled the way you smile at a conference when you're processing something significant and don't want to process it publicly. She moved on to talk to someone else. I stood where I was for a moment, and then I went back to my hotel room, sat on the edge of the bed, and did not cry, which is its own kind of breakdown. Crying releases pressure. What happens when you don't release the pressure is that it compresses into something harder, something denser, something that changes the structural integrity of how you move through rooms. I thought about what Vera Lynn had said, people can tell the difference, and I thought, then why is no one saying so openly? And then I answered my own question, because no one benefits from saying so except me, and my benefit, in the current configuration of institutional incentives, wasn't enough to matter to anyone else's calculation. After that conference, the record-keeping became deliberate, systematic. The beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet, but that I was doing with increasing purpose. Not immediately. There was a period of roughly 6 weeks where I processed the conference the way that smart people process things that are too uncomfortable to accept all at once, by interrogating my own interpretation. Maybe Vera had misread the paper. Maybe the framing really did constitute primary authorship by field convention. Maybe I was overestimating my own contribution the way junior researchers sometimes do when they're in a fragile emotional state. I listed all the alternative explanations. I evaluated them against the evidence I had. One by one, they didn't hold. What broke it fully open, not just the crack that had been widening but all the way open, was entirely accidental. I was looking for a file on our shared departmental server in November of my 5th year. A methodology appendix I needed for a grant application, a file I had saved and couldn't locate. I was clicking through subfolders I had navigated a dozen times before, going one level deeper than I usually did into a subfolder labeled with an internal project code, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me. I assumed it was an archived project from before my time at Whitmore. I clicked it out of the idle curiosity of someone who is procrastinating on a grant deadline. Inside was a single document. The document was titled __quote _22 _ NMO. My initials, Nadia M. Osei. I looked at those initials for a moment. Then I opened the document. 11 pages. Harlan's handwriting, scanned. He wrote by hand when he was thinking. I knew this. I had seen him do it in our meetings. The document was organized by project, chronologically, with dates going back to before I had officially started at Whitmore. For each project, there were columns. The first described the intellectual contribution, the research question, the theoretical framework, the methodological approach. The second noted the date and context of origin. The third column was labeled Published Attribution. In that third column, next to entry after entry after entry, the word Peck appeared. Sometimes Peck/Osei. Twice, just twice. Osei alone, beside the two papers where my name had appeared primary, both on minor topics, both in second-tier journals. I read through all 11 pages. He had been keeping a record of what he was taking. I want to pause here because this is the thing I needed to sit with, and I think you should sit with it too. He wasn't sloppy. He wasn't operating under some foggy, self-serving delusion that the ideas were fundamentally collaborative and attribution was therefore genuinely ambiguous. He was keeping a precise record, organized, dated, column-formatted, that allowed him to know at any point exactly what the ledger looked like. He knew what was mine. He had been documenting what was mine so he could track it, which means he had always known. I closed the folder. I did not save anything immediately because my hands were not reliable enough to trust the keyboard. I sat in the empty office for a while. Thursday evening, around 9:30, everyone else had gone home, and I thought about all the conversations I had with myself, where I questioned my own perceptions. I thought about all the meetings in that leather chair, all the explanations of how the field works, all the expressions of disappointment at my transactional thinking. I thought about Blessing saying, "See it clearly." I thought about Vera Lynn at the conference. Then I went home. I sat in my car in the parking spot for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 because I checked my phone when I got in, and again when I got out, and the drive itself had no purchase in my memory at all, which is how I knew the 22 minutes of stillness was the first moment I had been stationary enough for what I'd found to actually register. Then I made 3 decisions. 1. I would not confront him yet, not until I was ready, which meant not until the readiness itself became irrelevant to the outcome. 2. I would copy that document and every other piece of documentation I could access in multiple formats, stored in multiple locations. 3. I would tell one person because the only thing worse than what Harlan had been doing would be tipping him off before I was positioned to use what I had. The one person I told was Blessing. We met the next morning at a coffee shop far enough from campus that nobody from the department would be there on a weekday. I put my phone face down on the table, which was a habit I had developed for sensitive conversations and which Blessing recognized without comment, and I told her what I had found. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't say anything for 30 seconds, which with Blessing is a long time. She processes quickly and speaks when she has something to add. When she spoke, she said, quote 27. I said 6 months, maybe a little less. She said, quote 28. That was it. That was the entire conversation in terms of what needed to be said between us. I want you to know who Blessing Adeyemi is because she was essential to what came next, and I won't let her be a supporting character in her own story. She was 33 at the time, originally from Lagos, with a kind of scientific patience that could look to the uninitiated like slowness, but was actually something more precise. The patience of someone who is convinced there is a structure underneath the noise and is willing to wait for it to become visible rather than forcing a conclusion prematurely. She had been right about Harlan from the beginning of my time at Whitmore, and she had told me so in the gentlest possible terms, and she had waited without a word of reproach for me to catch up to what she already knew. That is a particular kind of friendship. I have tried since then to be that kind of friend to other people. She became my partner in the 6 months that followed. Invisibly, nothing changed in what was visible to anyone watching. I showed up to lab meetings, I produced work. I deferred to Harlan in the ways he expected to be deferred to. I watched him present my work at a February symposium, a presentation on memory interference in clinical populations built on 18 months of data collection that I had supervised. And I sat in the third row and took notes on my laptop. Clinical notes, time-stamped, each slide captured. I noted the questions from the audience that he deflected because they were about details of the methodology he didn't fully understand. A researcher from Penn asked about the parametric assumptions underlying the analysis. He said quote 29 instead of answering, because the model was mine and I had written it and he hadn't read the technical sections closely enough to field questions about them. I noted it. I noted the moment he described my lab's approach to theoretical framing using an orientation I had developed and documented in a file with my name on it dated 2019. Meanwhile, I was building the archive in parallel. The document from the server was the beginning. Over the following month, I went back through 5 years of records with the deliberateness of someone who knows that every piece will eventually need to matter. Every email chain downloaded, every draft document saved in 3 locations, an external hard drive that never touched the university network, a cloud account under a personal email address with no institutional connection, and a printed copy in a fireproof lockbox in my apartment that I had bought for $47 from a hardware store. $47. It was the best $47 of my professional life. I went back through the original drafts of every paper we had published together. I had kept them, my grandmother's training, I keep everything, with my tracked changes intact, my revisions visible in the version history, my comments in the margins. I had emails from before submissions in which I had sent him complete sections, sometimes full drafts, with my writing visible and my name in the sender field and the date stamp proving when the thinking had occurred. I had documentation that in some cases predated the published papers by a year or more. Then I found something I hadn't been looking for. In the full email archive, I found a chain from 6 years earlier, before I was at Whitmore, between Harlan and a research administrator named Conrad Mayer, who had since left the university. The chain was about a grant application, a major NIH grant that, according to the public grant database, Harlan had been awarded approximately 3 months before I arrived as his postdoc. I pulled the application from the NIH Public Archive. I read the preliminary data section. In the theoretical framework subsection, I found a 4-page conceptual model that was, I need you to understand this was not similarity, not parallel development, not independent convergence on the same idea, identical to the framework I had developed in the final chapter of my dissertation, which I had shared with Harlan during my application period when he had offered to review my work and give me feedback before I arrived. He had applied for and won federal research funding using my intellectual framework 7 months before I was his formal postdoc. My name appeared nowhere in that application. I read that section of the grant application 4 times. I compared it line by line to my dissertation chapter. I had a signed, submission-dated copy with my committee chair's signature on the title page. I printed both. I set them side by side on my desk. I looked at them for a long time. Then I called my attorney. Margaret Obie specialized in intellectual property and academic misconduct, with a secondary focus on research grant fraud, a specific subspecialty that exists because the specific circumstances it addresses are more common than most people in academia want to publicly acknowledge. I had found her through a professional network, a loose community of researchers who talked quietly in encrypted channels about exactly the kind of situation I was in. She had been recommended with the specific endorsement that mattered most. She wins, not always, but consistently, and by being thorough in a way that eventually makes the alternative position very tired. I had been paying for consultation sessions for 2 months before I found the grant information. Small meetings, 2 hours each, laying groundwork, building a map. She listened the way good attorneys listen, not just to what you're saying, but to what it connects to, what it establishes, what it can be made to demonstrate in a document that has a formal heading on it. When I told her about the grant, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The grant is the anchor. Everything else builds from there." She was right. Attribution disputes in academia are handled, to the extent they are handled at all, through internal processes that are slow, opaque, and structurally weighted toward seniority. The person with 16 pages of CV moves through those processes more easily than the person with 1 page. That is the design, even when it isn't the stated intention. But the grant was a different kind of evidence, in a different kind of system, with a different kind of consequence. He had used my unpublished intellectual property to obtain federal funding. That was not an ambiguous attribution question. That had a statutory name. I need to tell you about 2 other people because no institutional story is honest if it presents the central villain as the only person who made choices. Patrick Sternfeld was the department chair. 68 years old, had been in his position long enough that the position had become indistinguishable from his identity as a person. He and Harlan had been in graduate school together, which was 35 or 40 years of mutual professional investment, depending on how you calculated it. They had served on each other's grant review committees. They had written each other's tenure letters at 2 previous institutions. The arrangement between them was not explicitly corrupt in the way that corruption is depicted in films. It was more structural than that, more habitual. Sternfeld had learned over decades to maintain the conditions under which Harlan's success was possible, because Harlan's success was part of the foundation of the department he ran, and questioning the foundation is uncomfortable when you are standing on it. He knew, on some level, that Harlan's output in his 60s, consistently groundbreaking, consistently influential, at a rate that didn't match his output in the decade prior, was statistically improbable. The field has a shape. People's intellectual peaks have a shape. What Harlan's recent CV looked like was not the shape of a man experiencing a second authentic flowering. It was the shape of a man who had found a very reliable source. Sternfeld didn't examine this because examining it had costs, and not examining it had none. That was the calculation. Simple, but not innocent. In month 4 of my 6 months, I had my annual tenure progress meeting with Sternfeld. It was a routine meeting, the kind where a senior person tells a junior person how they're doing in terms vague enough to be plausibly deniable as feedback. He told me my publication record showed promise. He said my profile of independent contribution was not yet where it would need to be for a strong tenure case. He used the word "32_ twice. Harlan controlled what I published independently versus collaboratively, and Sternfeld knew this. He had been in the same department for 20 years, and he was not stupid, and he was still saying it to my face with a helpful expression. He said I might want to think about whether my research focus was __33__. I was, in that moment, sitting across a desk from a man who was essentially telling me that the solution to having my work taken from me was to produce different work. I looked at him. I said, "34. I smiled in the way that a person smiles when they have 3 copies of evidence in a lockbox at home. He nodded with the satisfaction of someone who believes they have been helpful. He had delivered a message, just not the one he thought. Sylvia Park was an associate professor in the department, 55, the kind of academic who had achieved stability by never taking a position more than 1 degree removed from the dominant power in the room. She had been friendly with Harlan in the specifically weightless way of people who value the social access that proximity to power provides without wanting to examine what that access costs or who it costs it to. She had observed what was happening in enough detail to make a joke about it at a holiday party in my 2nd year. She had leaned over with a conspiratorial warmth that implied we were on the same side of something and said, ___, She had laughed, lightly, and turned to talk to someone else. She had seen it clearly enough to joke about it. She had chosen to treat it as knowing sophistication rather than a problem that required action. This is what institutions do when they want to feel sophisticated about injustice, while not actually doing anything about it. In month 5, I had a conversation with Harlan about my 10-year timeline. He sat in his leather chair, reupholstered twice, good investment, and said the timing was, quote, 36, and that he would advocate strongly for, quote, 37 one more year. This was the 14th month in which some version of, quote, 38 had been applied to my timeline by a man who needed me in that position for another year because of what I was producing in it. I said, quote, 39, I got up. I left his office, I walked down the corridor, I texted Margaret Obi 3 words, quote, 40. We set the date for the university's annual Academic Integrity and Research Governance meeting. I want to explain the choice of that venue specifically because it was not accidental. The meeting was attended by every senior faculty member in the department, the university's research compliance office, and, critically, the NIH program officer who managed Harlan's grant portfolio. Her name was Dr. Christine Hall, and she was present because the university had recently launched an initiative around research transparency that had made her inclusion appropriate. Also present were 2 members of the Board of Trustees and the Provost's deputy for research integrity. Harlan was at this meeting to present new language on attribution and mentorship that he had himself proposed, language that would, had it passed, have formalized the structure that had protected him for 12 years. He was expecting to win in this room. He had always won in this room, in various configurations, over decades. The meeting was held in the Founders Gallery, named for donors, which tells you something about the institution's understanding of who deserves recognition, with high windows and natural light and a long oak table and the particular institutional gravity that makes everyone sit up slightly straighter than they normally do. I arrived early. I always arrive early. Early gives you information about the room before the room becomes about something. I chose a seat midway down the table, not at the periphery, which signals irrelevance, not at the power end, which would draw attention I didn't want yet. I had a leather portfolio containing nothing of significance. I had a yellow legal pad. I had a glass of water. I was wearing the gray blazer, my best one, the one that fits correctly and communicates something about how seriously I take whatever moment I'm dressed for, even when no one knows yet which moment matters. Harlan arrived 12 minutes after me with coffee and a tablet and the ease of a man who has owned every room he's walked into for 30 years. He chose the seat nearest Sternfeld's position at the head of the table, which was both automatic and revealing. He oriented toward power by instinct. He nodded at me when he sat, warmly. The warmth of a man who is not worried about anything in this room. Margaret Obi sat beside me. She had the stillness of someone who has been in contentious rooms many times and understands that stillness is itself a form of authority. Sternfeld opened the meeting. Agenda items moved through with practiced efficiency. When he reached research compliance and attribution standards, he nodded at Harlan, who stood. He had notes but barely consulted them because he had prepared well. He said, __quote _41 __. He looked around the table. He made eye contact with Christine Hall. He made eye contact with Sternfeld. He did not look at me with any particular attention because I was not the concern. I was the postdoc. I was, as far as he understood the room, furniture. He said, Margaret Obi opened her portfolio. I said, Harlan looked at me. The room looked at me. Christine Hall looked at me and picked up her pen. I had said nothing for 47 minutes. I had been taking notes, quietly, on my legal pad. This was the first sound I had made in any direction. I said, __quote _44 __a, very small silence. The kind of silence that is actually a room recalibrating. Harlan said, Quote 45, I said, quote 46, I turned directly to the NIH program officer. Quote 47, Christine Hall set her pen down. Then she picked it back up. She said, with the care of someone choosing words in a room where they will matter, __, quote _48 __. I said, I opened the portfolio. I placed the documents on the table. Margaret Obi simultaneously placed an identical complete set in front of Christine Hall. The room had a different quality of air in it. These things happen in bodies before they happen in words. I watched people shift, watched hands become still on the table, watched eyes go to the documents rather than to faces. Harlan said, quote 52 he stopped. He started again, and his voice was still even, because he was very good at keeping his voice even. It was one of the things I had always noted about him. Quote 53, I said. Quote 54. I found the printed page. I read it without inflection, which is the most precise way to read something that doesn't need help. The second section of the memory framework is Nadia's work. We should discuss attribution before submission. The paper was submitted to the journal 6 weeks later with your name as primary author and mine as second. I placed the page on the table. I have a document in your handwriting. And here I placed it where he could see it, carefully, with both hands, titled Research Pipeline, NMO Contributions, Attribution Notes. I believe you'll recognize it. I watched his face. He looked at the handwritten document on the table. The document he had apparently believed was either destroyed or safely inaccessible. His own notation, organized by project, with dates, and in the third column, what he had published it as. What happened in his face was not collapse. He was not a man who collapses visibly. What happened was more precise, a series of small recalibrations, as if each new piece of information required him to redraw a map he had been navigating with confidence. The pen in his hand went still. His jaw made a small adjustment. A muscle at the outer corner of his left eye contracted once, twice. He was looking at something in his own handwriting that said, in organized columns, exactly what he had done, and he was calculating whether there was still a version of this room he could navigate his way out of. Patrick Sternfeld said, I think it might be appropriate to pause the meeting and, Christine Hall said, I think we should continue. She said it with the quality of someone who has just determined that pausing serves the wrong party. She was looking at the documents in front of her. I have some questions about the 2018 grant application. Sylvia Park, sitting 3 seats from me, looked at the table in front of her. She did not look at Harlan. She did not look at me. She had chosen, at the moment of maximum consequence, the deliberate neutrality she had been maintaining for years, and now it was fully visible as a choice rather than a posture. Everyone in the room could see it. Harlan's last attempt came about 15 minutes in. He said, quote 61 __. He said it with authority. He almost pulled it off. He was right about part of it. Mentorship contributions are real and sometimes under-recognized. He was deploying a real truth in service of a false conclusion, which is a specific kind of dishonesty that requires a particular kind of preparation to counter. I said, quote 62. I waited 1 beat. Quote 63, Christine Hall said, quote 64. She did. Harlan sat down. He didn't leave dramatically. There was no storming out, no scene. That would have been a performance, and performances require the belief that the audience can still be moved, and he had lost that belief in the previous 20 minutes. He sat there, and the meeting continued around him, and with each exchange, Christine Hall's procedural questions, Margaret Obi's methodical documentation, Sternfeld's increasingly careful neutrality, he got smaller, not physically. The way a structure gets smaller when you understand what was actually holding it up and that thing is gone. The NIH's Office of Research Integrity opened a formal investigation within 3 weeks. Margaret had already filed pre-notification documents the week before the meeting, which meant that by the time we sat in the Founders Gallery, Christine Hall had already received a preliminary notification. The meeting wasn't the beginning. It was the moment the process became visible to everyone who needed to see it. The investigation ran 14 months. It was thorough. These things take time because thoroughness has its own pace, and I had waited long enough that more waiting was not the difficulty. The finding, when it came, was that the 2018 grant application had misrepresented the intellectual origin of the preliminary theoretical framework. The NIH required a formal correction to the grant record and imposed conditions on future applications from Harlan's laboratory. The university conducted its own parallel review, which resulted in new attribution documentation requirements being implemented across all federally funded research projects in the department, requirements that, had they existed 6 years earlier, would have made it significantly harder to do what Harlan had done. The 12 published papers went to the relevant journals for authorship review. This process is slow because journal processes are slow, and corrections are uncomfortable for everyone involved in the original publication. Several reviews have concluded. On 4 papers, my name has been moved to first authorship in the corrected record. The rest are ongoing. I am patient with the process. Process, when it moves in the right direction, is worth the wait. Harlan Peck took a medical leave of absence from Whitmore 7 months after the Founders Gallery meeting. He has not returned. His CV is 16 pages long. It will always be 16 pages long, and it will always have corrections attached to it, and that is the document that will exist in the field's record indefinitely. Academic corrections are not dramatic. They are durable. That was always what I wanted. Not a scene, a record. Patrick Sternfeld retired at the end of the academic year. The retirement was announced as planned. Whether it had been planned before that meeting, I genuinely do not know and do not particularly care. He sent me one email in January. 2 sentences expressing regret that the departmental environment had not been quote, _65, _. I read it twice. I noted the passive construction. The environment had not been supportive, rather than, I allowed an environment. I knew what was happening. I told you, your independent contribution wasn't strong enough while knowing exactly why. I did not respond. This was not pettiness. It was a judgment about what a response would accomplish. He knows what he permitted. A response from me would offer him the possibility of absolution, and he should sit with what he allowed without anyone offering him relief from it. Sylvia Park reached out 4 months later. She wanted to have coffee. She said she had always admired my resilience. I noted the word, resilience. Not contributions, not record, not intelligence. Resilience, the quality you admire in someone who has been through something, which allows you to acknowledge the something while declining to examine your relationship to it. I said I had a full schedule and wished her well. I have not heard from her since. I think this was the correct exchange. Not hostile, not warm, not forgiving, not condemning. Just accurate. The 3 researchers before me, the 2 who had left academia and the one in Nevada, I found out about through the investigation. 2 of them had kept records. I am not in a position to tell their stories because those stories belong to them. What I can tell you is that those records exist, and the investigation has them. Blessing Adeyemi is a tenured associate professor at a research university 2 states away. She got there on the strength of her computational work, which was always where she was going, because she is genuinely exceptional, and also because she never let anyone put their name on her work without a fight she had prepared to win. She was at the Founders Gallery because she was faculty, and because she knew what the meeting was. Afterward, in the specific silence of a room full of people processing what they've witnessed, she came over to me. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on my arm briefly. That was sufficient. That was, in fact, the most complete exchange I had that entire day. My tenure case was submitted 3 months after the investigation's preliminary findings to a newly constituted review committee. It was reviewed on the basis of my actual work, primary authorship corrections on 4 papers, 2 independent publications I had been quietly developing in parallel for 2 years, a funded research proposal, and a graduate student supervision record I had been building carefully because I understood what it meant to have a good mentor and exactly what it meant not to. The independent NIH grant, same program as Harlan's 2018 grant, different framework entirely, my name alone on the application, came through 8 months before the tenure decision. When the decision came, it was positive. I am now running a lab. My name is on the door. I have two researchers under my supervision, a PhD student named Kwame, 27, already thinking in ways I recognize from my own early notebooks, the kind of thinking that has its own architecture before it knows how to explain itself, and a postdoc named Dr. Lena Vogel, who came from a different institution, and who I noticed in her first month kept her original drafts organized by date and category in a carefully maintained folder. I mentioned once that I thought this was a good habit. She said someone had told her to always document everything. I said, "Smart person." I left it there. My research right now is on how collaborative memory processes are distorted by power differentials in group settings, how the person with more institutional authority shapes not just the external record of who thought what, but the internal perceptions of the other people in the room. It is, I am aware, extremely on the nose. I am doing it anyway, because the data are genuinely interesting. The implications for how we structure attribution in team science are significant. And because if I couldn't use what happened to me to ask better questions, what was the point of surviving it? My apartment is quiet in the mornings, which I value in a way I didn't know how to value before. I make coffee in a French press because drip coffee tastes like accommodation. I have a small desk next to an east-facing window, and I work there for 2 hours before I go to campus. And some mornings, the light through that window is so direct and clean that it looks like something arranged. I sit in that light, and I work on my own research with my own name on the files, and I think about how long I waited to be in exactly this room, doing exactly this thing, under exactly these conditions. I don't wake up thinking about Harlan Peck. This is not an achievement I worked toward. It is just what happened when enough time passed and enough of the structure around what he had done was dismantled by process and documentation and the specific patient tedium of pursuing something through legitimate channels until it goes where it should. I don't replay the Founders Gallery meeting looking for moments where I could have been sharper. I think about the research. I think about Kwame's dissertation methodology. I think about what it meant to have a mentor who used his power well, and I understand, in a way that only the opposite experience can teach, exactly what that looks like and what it requires. There is a particular quality of silence that follows a long, careful fight, not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of something over, the silence of something settled, which means the foundation is sound, which means you can build on it, which means the silence is not an ending, but a beginning on solid ground. My grandmother said, "The one who plants the seed does not always eat the fruit." She was right, and I held that sentence at every stage of this, filing originals in a lockbox, sitting in meetings while Harlan explained my own thinking to audiences, texting my attorney from a corridor, waiting through 14 months of investigation for a finding I was already sure of. I planted in soil that was mine in ways that left marks. The marks were always there. The archive does not lie. The archive is patient. The archive waited until someone with the authority to read it looked. If I could say something to the person I was the evening I found that document, sitting very still in an empty office at 9:30 at night, looking at 11 pages in his handwriting that explained everything I had been unable to name, I would say, "This is not going to be fast. Nothing done correctly in a situation like this is fast. It is going to take more than you think you have, and then it is going to take more than that, and somewhere in finding that extra thing you will discover that you have more than you knew." Which is both the good news and the hard news. It is going to require you to sit in rooms and say reasonable things while someone explains your own thinking to people who cannot yet tell the difference, and it is going to require you to trust, not blindly, not against evidence, but as a calculated conclusion from what you can see, that documentation is patient, and precision is patient, and the truth about who made what does not disappear just because someone with a longer CV decided to put his name on it. And I want to say, you are going to be okay. Not in the weak sense of surviving, in the sense of coming out the other side and finding that what's waiting there is your own work, in your own name, in morning light through a window that faces east. That is enough. It is actually more than enough. It is exactly everything I needed it to be. Thank you so much for watching. If you loved this story, More of my most gripping stories are already on your screen right now. Click one. I promise you won't stop watching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. New stories every week. See you in the next one.